Thank you very much, Paul, for that introduction. First, I need to explain the two parts of my title. By the green zones, I mean the no-take zones of the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park. Now, these were set up to conserve bioregions of the reef, and most people tend to agree that that's a good idea. What it also means is that whilst fish in the blue zones are available to fishing, fish in the green zones are not, and therein lies the controversy. What good to fishing is a coral trout in the green zone? Now, I want to at least counter that controversy tonight by at least suggesting that the green zones might work for both conservation and fisheries. The second part of my title was inspired by a book called The Salmon of Doubt by Douglas Adams. Douglas Adams wrote The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. He also wrote for Monty Python and Doctor Who. Now, Adams, in the Salmon of Doubt, wrote a beautiful chapter on scuba diving on the Barrier Reef in which he describes it as the best week of his life. So I kind of thought it'd be fun to allow him to guide us through this brief talk tonight. Now, whilst for most of his life Adams had science fiction and planets kind of revolving around his head, for me, it's been coral trouts in green zones. You see, for the past 30 years of my life, I'm trying to convince fishers that they might be better off not fishing everywhere, and it's a pretty hard gig, let me tell you. Everyone knows you're going to catch more fish the more places you've got to fish, right? So, you know, who is this fool scientist? Now, Adams gives me a bit of solace here, that you can't possibly be a scientist if you mind people thinking that you're a fool. I actually didn't think myself as a fool. I kind of thought of myself as a bit of a visionary, a bit of a pioneer. So this quote from Adams I thought was far more me. He was a dreamer, a thinker, a speculative philosopher, or, as his wife would have it, an idiot. So if everyone thinks I'm an idiot and a fool, I better explain myself. When you set up a green zone, you hope that you produce more fish and bigger fish when you stop fishing. Now, 15 years of underwater counts on the inshore reefs of the Great Barrier Reef have shown that the green zones have 2 to 3 times more coral trout than the blue zones. For years, we've taken this sort of data along to fishing meetings and said, hey, look, green zones produce more fish and bigger fish. And inevitably, the response would be, well, that's great, mate. More fish and bigger fish where I can't fish. What good is that to me? And it's a reasonable sort of response. Inevitably, we would come back with, well, given the size of the green zones and the fact that the coral trout have a larvae that goes up into the water column for nearly 30 days, it'll almost certainly spread out and seed the blue fish zones. Prove it. Prove it. Inevitably, the response would be, and it's that proving that link between green and blue is what I mean by countering the coral trout of doubt. We assembled a very large group of scientists together to take on this massive challenge. To succeed, they would have to do something that no other group had done in 100 years of fisheries science, and that is to track the larvae of a tiny little larvae of a large marine food fish from spawning to settlement. Never been done before. We enlisted the help of recreational fishing clubs to fish the green zones of the Keppel Islands. We used barbless hooks so we could catch the adults, take a small genetic sample, put the fish back in the water alive, and then spent the next 2 summers collecting recruits, the new little baby coral trout that settle onto the reefs. We linked the mums and dads to the babies by genetic parentage analysis. So what did we find? Here's a map showing where the coral trout larvae went from the green zones, those 3 little squares that you see in the Keppel Islands. You can see the larvae are going all over the place, basically. You can see the scale there. The 2 critical points that came out of this study were the following: that green zones produce larvae of coral trout that go to blue zones. And secondly, and really importantly, about a quarter of the coral reefs in the Keppel Islands are in the no-take green zones, but those reefs produced over a half of the new baby settling coral trout settling into the blue zones. In other words, on an aerial basis, those tiny little green zones were punching above their weight by a factor of about 2. Now, why would they do that? Probably because there was about twice as many coral trout in the green zones. Now, hang on, isn't that exactly what you would expect? Wouldn't you expect areas that have twice as many mums and dads to produce twice as many babies? Haven't we just kind of proven common sense? Surely that fool scientist from the university couldn't have been right, surely. So, look, I'm a realist. I know that some people, some of the fishing stakeholders will doubt us. I don't believe it. Prove it to me and I still won't believe it. We've heard that a few times before. But it just seems to me that the Keppel Island study is just plain common sense. And there are very few writers in the English language who do rationality and common sense much better than Douglas Adams. If it looks like a duck, quacks like a duck, we have to at least consider the possibility that we have a small aquatic bird of the family Anatidae on our hands. or in the context of this talk, countering the coral trout of doubt, is simply a defence of common sense. Thank you.